Hey everybody, welcome back to Dagish America Presents. I'm your host, Ben Harrell, and we're continuing with Season 6, where we're digging into all aspects of leadership in the fumigation industry. So far this season, we've talked about safety, time management, team building, and mentorship. But today, we're going to take on one of the most critical leadership challenges of all, leading through a crisis. When you work in fumigation, emergencies can sometimes happen, and when they do, your team looks to one place first, their leader. In this episode, we're going to talk about crisis leadership, how strong, prepared leadership can make the difference between chaos and control when the unexpected strikes. We'll look at communication strategies and how leaders can stay calm, make quick decisions, and protect their teams and clients while under pressure. And to help us unpack it all, I've invited Blake Buckner, Director of Operations here at Dagish America, to the show. Blake has seen his share of field challenges and knows exactly how critical it is to lead with clarity, poise, and purpose during an emergency. So please help me welcome Blake to the podcast. Blake, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Ben. The weather's warm, the bugs are out, getting busy.
Yep, anytime the bugs are out, that's good for us. That means that we are staying busy and we are making money, right?
That's right.
Well, thanks again for being here. I really appreciate it. This season we're talking about leadership in the pest control and fumigation industry, and I couldn't think of anybody better to talk to about today's topic, which is how to manage emergencies and unexpected events when they do happen in the field. And I know that you have a lot of experience in the field and you have a lot of management experience, so I think you're about the perfect person to talk about this today.
Well, I certainly appreciate that, Ben. In fumigation, there's always things that pop up. No fumigation is the same as another. I like to think that we've had a little bit of experience in it. I don't know how many of them rise to the level of emergency, but there's definitely a bunch of moving parts with each fumigation. So I appreciate it again.
All right, so I think I'm just going to jump right in to the conversation today. I know that leading people in emergency situations can be a little tough. So I just kind of wanted to ask you, in your experience, what separates a strong crisis leader from someone who may actually freeze under that pressure?
That's a really good question, Ben, to come out of the gate with. And,
yeah.
Unfortunately, it's one of those things. I do have a sort of an answer, but I'll start by saying that unfortunately, you don't really know until you know what separates someone who responds well in a crisis or an emergency versus someone who doesn't until it happens. But I will say that preparedness is king. Preparedness comes first. And another unfortunate thing that you have to realize, especially in our industry, is that you have to expect the worst. I get a lot of flack at home. We'll be driving down the road on the interstate and I'll be like, watch that car up there, make sure that they're doing this and make sure they're doing that. It's just in my nature now to expect the worst and work backwards from there. And that's not to say that, I live in fear or anything like that. But if you sort of prepare yourself for the worst, then you'll likely be more ready in the event that the worst happens. I know it's kind of a grim outlook, but, it's kind of the truth of fumigation crisis management, if you will. So, again, I'm not in any way saying that you need to live in fear, but when you're preparing yourself for emergencies, you definitely need to expect the worst.
No, and you're completely right on that. I mean, anytime that I've ever tried to lead a fumigation team or prepare for a fumigation, I always think the same way. Like you said, every facility is different. Every fumigation is different. So you have to go into it looking at it with fresh eyes, and you have to think to yourself, what could go wrong? And then you have a list of things that could go wrong. Okay, now how do I prepare for those things in case they go wrong? Not only how do I prevent them from going wrong, which is a whole other topic of conversation, but how do I prepare in the event that something may go wrong, whether it's a blown seal, whether it's bad weather coming in, whatever the case may be. You kind of have to have a plan in place. One thing that I did want to mention that I thought was really cool, and this has to do with planning and a little bit of prevention as well. I worked with a fumigation company. This has been several years ago. They were fumigating a flour mill, and it's a multi-story flour mill. And what they did is they actually, when we go in to aerate these facilities, we always have to wear SCBAs, of course, because your time-weighted average is going to be high enough that it dictates that you need an SCBA. But what they would do is they would actually stage these spare tanks on the roof of the facility, knowing that if an emergency happened, they may need to have quick access to those SCBAs. And the shortest route to fresh air isn't necessarily always out the front door at the ground level. Sometimes the roof is the shortest access point to fresh air. So they would actually stage these tanks in areas where they may need them in case some kind of an emergency did happen. And I just thought that was really, really smart. And it's a great example of what that preparation kind of entails.
Absolutely, Ben. That's something that we do as well. We don't have it written into any of our SOPs or anything, but generally, if it's more than 2, 3, 4 floors, something like that, depending on the egress points, we'll definitely stage tanks. If it's a 6, 7 story building, we'll stage some tanks just like you said, just in case. You never know when you're going to need all 25 or 30 minutes of air and more. So yeah, it's a very good point, and it's something that we do in our operations as well.
Yeah, and speaking of SCBA tanks, I mean, I've also been in situations where I've seen people, anybody who's worn an SCBA tank, that when you start getting close, like around that 5-minute warning, depending on what kind of SCBA you're wearing, you may get a whistle, you may get a bell. There's going to be some kind of a warning to let you know, hey, you're not out of air, but you're heading in that direction. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen people, they get into that situation and they almost go into like a panic mode and they rush for the door as fast as they can. And the issue with that is, now granted, you want to make sure you're in fresh air by the time you're out of SCBA air. But if you rush, if you hurry and you don't act calmly, that's going to increase your risk of potential injury. I've seen people fall down stairwells wearing SCBAs because they're moving too fast. They're not used to the weight, whatever the case is. So you always have to be cognizant of that. But then also, even further into that, particularly with SCBAs, I know I'm talking a lot about SCBAs here, but it's a good topic to cover. With SCBAs, it's a good idea to put one on, get accustomed to it, wear it when it's in non-emergency situations so you kind of know how it feels, how to move, turn corners, walk through doors with it on in non-emergency situations because it's extra weight and it's extra volume that's on your back. And you want to be careful. If you move wrong, if you bump wrong, if you lean in the wrong direction on a stairwell, on a stairwell, you could very easily lose your balance, especially if you're in an emergency situation. So that's another one of those things that you can do to prepare.
Absolutely. And, you have to be very, very close to an exit when you run out of air. And in fact, I would say that it's a very good idea to not even let yourself get close. Always plan out where you're going to be and how much air you have. And we've even gone as far in some situations with massive facilities to time out how long it takes to walk from one place to the other.
Yes.
From the center of the facility to exit B or the center of the facility to exit A. And that sort of goes back to the second question. How do you prepare for these emergencies? And that's exactly how. You have to train, you have to drill to these situations. You always need to know how far away you are from an exit. You always need to know how far away you are from a fence line if a seal were to blow. Exactly what are we going to do if this happens? It all goes back to, like I said, preparedness.
Yeah, exactly. And even preparation even goes into keeping bystanders safe as well. Having secondary locks on the structure, knowing all of the contractors or any facility members that may be on site during the fumigation and making sure that they're aware of what's going on and that you can keep them out of the structure. We all have those nightmare scenarios that we hear about where somebody's went into a fumigated structure and either gotten really sick or maybe passed away or something because, the warning signs and the placards, they're great. They're a label requirement and they're supposed to deter people, but the secondary locks are the best method to keep people out because we all know those types of people that think in their head, if I just hold my breath long enough and run in, I can grab that thing that I left in my office.
Yeah, we've sort of digressed from the point, but that's a very good point. It's something that we always take very seriously, and it's the secondary locks. That goes back to expecting the worst. Placards, you can seal a door with tape, you can put up barricades, you can put up everything, but you have to assume that person X, Y, or Z is going to get in there for whatever reason. Whether they're breaking in, they think computers are in there, they don't see the signs. You always have to prepare for, again, the worst case scenario, and that's that somebody is going to not adhere to the placard. So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. It's sort of off from the emergency and the unexpected events thing, but it would definitely be an unexpected event where the secondary lock's not in place. So.
And I know secondary locks aren't really like an emergency situation. It's not an emergency response, but
they could be.
Well, they could be, yeah. But it goes right back into that prevention scenario like what you're talking about, where you're preventing emergencies from happening, or you're trying to prevent emergencies from happening. That way you don't have to respond to an emergency. And that's why that planning and preparation is so important. So what do you think are some of the most common mistakes that leaders might make in a crisis situation?
Oh man, number one, I would say that people lead with emotion when put into an emergency or a crisis situation. It's very, very difficult to not let your emotions get a hold of you, but you have to take a deep breath and you have to go back to your procedures, go back to your preparedness. And the most important thing is to not break any further rules. You can't turn what would be a fumigation emergency, a blown seal or something of that nature, into a human emergency. So keep your emotions in check, take a deep breath, and go back to your training. I would say that the biggest mistake, and probably the only mistake that you can make as a leader in a crisis situation, is to lead with emotion or to break rules once an emergency has happened. You have to fall back on your training and stay in compliance with, with all the regulations that dictate what we do.
Yeah, and I think that those are absolutely awesome things that leaders need to remember. And it's so easy to fall into that emotional state. And everybody, not just leaders, anybody that's in an emergency situation. I mean, if something happens that's emergent, usually your adrenaline comes up, your pulse quickens. Things happen that make it really difficult to not slide into that emotional state. And that's where practice, preparation, and training come in place, because not that you go into autopilot, you don't want to do that in an emergency situation either, but if what you need to do is second nature, it becomes easier to do when you're not in the best mental state. And I'll also say, I think another mistake that I see some leaders have made in the past is maybe assuming that their employees have been properly trained, or assuming that their employees are going to be able to react in a similar fashion or in a calm fashion during crisis situations. And you can't really assume, even if they've been trained or if they haven't been trained, you can't assume that they've been trained. You have to make sure and confirm that they've been trained. And then also, you can't assume that they're going to be reacting in a calm fashion. So you may have to calm them as well as keeping yourself calm, because you are the leader and you set the example.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself, Ben. It goes back to when we first started talking here today, and it's not all people are going to be able to hold themselves together in that situation. And like I said before, you don't know until you know. So at that point, you kind of have to become a counselor first and triage your employees, if you will, to figure out who's capable of doing what, and making sure that the directions are clear and that they're comfortable and they're knowledgeable on what you're asking them to do, whether it's, CPR in the worst case scenario, or something as simple as, can you put this mask on and fix that vent? You need to make sure that your directions are clear and you're not speaking out of haste. And the one thing that I was going to say, back to leading with emotion, the worst thing you can do in that situation is start blaming. That's for later.
Yeah.
That's for later. You don't want to put any blames. You need to put a clear line of delineation in there. Let's fix this first, and we'll figure out what happened later. So,
yep, that's all excellent points. And then also, one last thing I'll say about that when it comes to working with, as a leader, with your team members in emergency situations, is every person's different every single day, just like every fumigation's different every time you do it. So you may have a very, very strong leader or a very strong team member on one day, but maybe they didn't get very much sleep the night before. Maybe they didn't drink enough water and they're slightly dehydrated. Maybe they're hungry. There could be all these physical or physiological or psychological things going on in their brains that make them a lot less likely to respond to the emergency in the best possible fashion. So you have to be kind of aware of that. As the leader, you want to make sure that your employees are properly hydrated, that they're eating enough, that they're getting enough sleep, and that they're in the best condition they can be in the event of an emergency. But you have to as a leader, have to make sure that you yourself are in the best kind of condition that you can be in. And given our industry, sometimes that's a little hard to do, because we do work a lot of long hours as fumigators.
Definitely do, Ben. And that's kind of leads me down another path. And that's a lot of times, like I said, you don't want to break any rules. And a lot of times in emergencies, it'll lead you down a path of, do I follow procedures? Do I stay compliant? What do I do here? And I think that It all goes back to an old adage that most of us have probably heard. And the important thing is that's why you put the oxygen mask on yourself before you put it on children's, because if you're not taking care of yourself, then you're not going to be able to assist others. And this is sort of on the emergency front, but I would say for sure that you have to stop and assess the scene and make sure exactly what's going on. Again, I keep saying this, but you need to determine first and foremost, is this a fumigation emergency or is this a human emergency, and not let the former become the latter. So take care of yourself, because if you're the leader, then people are looking to you for instruction and you're not taking care of yourself, then everybody's going to be in a tough spot.
Yeah, and you know what? You really bring up a really good point there. You know, when you're on the airline and they say, "Hey, make sure you put your own oxygen mask on first before you put it on your neighbor or your friend or your family or child or whatever the case is." And really, it does become a kind of a situation of trying to figure out how to balance the urgency of the emergency or potential emergency with the need to follow procedures and stay compliant. And I would always caution people, lean back onto the label. Now, again, in an emergency situation, you may not have time to say, "Hey, wait a second, let me pull out the label and let me read it," because some of these labels are really large. But part of being prepared for emergencies is reading and understanding the labels and maintaining that compliance. Because if you do that, you're really significantly not only reducing the chances of emergencies, but you're also leaning back onto a document that really kind of tells you, for the most part, how to respond to most emergencies, kind of in a generic, general fashion. You know, again, every fumigation is different, but it's such an awesome place to start from. Just lean on the label, lean on the manuals, lean on the SDSs, and start there. That'd be my best advice to give people when it comes to how to balance your emergencies with the need to follow procedures and stay compliant.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The labels will have most of the information in there. And in addition to that, a lot of the emergency response should be written into your FMPs as well. FMPs, the basic requirements are the basic requirements, but here at Dagish, most of our FMPs are pretty robust and would contain a good bit of that information on how to respond on those emergencies, and are updated with every fumigation. And then also on your point, I was thinking while you were talking again, I think I'm breaking a cardinal conversation rule, but when you said something, it sparked in my mind. One thing that's not in the label, it comes to mind right away, is like in a grain bin and engulfment. So if a person unfortunately becomes engulfed, your first instinct is going to be, man, I got to get down there and get him. But, obviously we know that without the proper procedures and equipment in place, that's not what you're going to want to do. So that's a perfect example of balancing the urgency to save someone or help someone with what's right. It's just something I thought about when you were saying it. So it's definitely worth noting that don't go in after somebody if you don't have the SCBA. I know we're talking a lot about SCBAs and oxygen masks and things like that, but if you're not properly trained or outfitted, then don't make the same mistake that the person that's in trouble made.
Yeah, because you're not going to help anybody if you are also succumbing to whatever the emergency is.
Right. Yep.
Yeah, and I mean, speaking of another example here, I remember watching a video. This was several years ago, but it leans into the agricultural industry that we're kind of part of. There was a farmer hauling an ammonia tank down a roadway toward his farm, and he got in a wreck, and the ammonia split open, and a big gas cloud came out, which he succumbed to. And then people that were driving behind him, I think it was a sheriff actually was driving behind him because there was a dash cam, hopped out and ran into the gas cloud to try to rescue the farmer, and then also succumbed and passed away in the gas cloud of ammonia. So again, that's a situation where you want to be helpful, you want to come to the rescue, but you have to be careful, because if you respond inappropriately, you just become another victim. And that's the last thing anybody wants.
That's right. Making the worst case scenario worse somehow.
Yeah, exactly. So this is kind of a loaded question, I guess, because it's such a general question, but I'm going to ask you anyway. What role do you think communication plays during a high-stress incident?
It's everything. It's absolutely everything. Most of the listeners, and of course everybody at Dagish, has been through the CPR and first aid training and stuff like that. The first thing to do, and it doesn't always have to be a manager or a director or anything like that. First of all, one person needs to be in charge, and they need to be the one giving the instructions of what to do, where to go, how to do it. And the direction needs to be clear and concise with not a lot of words, because obviously time is of the essence at that point. So, and then I mentioned a little bit about this earlier. Make sure to confirm with the person that you're giving the communication to, that you're giving the direction to. Make sure to confirm that they know what you said and they know how to do what you asked them to do. So it's a long way of saying that communication is king, but I can't think of a more important thing when it comes to managing emergencies and crazy events that happen in the field.
That's an excellent point. And, that kind of goes right back to what I was alluding to earlier on when I was saying you can't assume as a leader that the person that you're communicating to understands what you're trying to say. You have to be able to confirm and prove that they understand it. Even if it comes to basic application procedures, you have to make sure that they understand how to apply and how to apply safely. You can't assume that they know, because if they don't, they could potentially create an emergency in that situation. So you just have to make sure that communication is being clearly stated and that the people completely understand what you're trying to convey.
Yep, absolutely. That's right.
So if you have an emergency and you've responded appropriately and everything has been handled and the dust has settled, everybody's safe, how do you debrief your team at that point? And how do you and your team members learn from the event?
I think it varies greatly. I keep kind of splitting them down the middle between fumigation and actual human emergencies. So I would say we'll stay on the human emergency side. The first thing that you want to do is make sure that every employee that was involved in it is okay, both physically and mentally. How you doing? Is everything? Are you okay? Do you need to get medical help? How do you feel about what happened? It doesn't need to be a long, drawn out conversation. I'm not suggesting that, they need to immediately get psychiatric care and things like that. Just check on your people, make sure that they're doing okay. And then, once that sort of dust is settled, not to be repetitive on the question, but then you sort of want to do almost like a forensic analysis of the event. What happened? What caused this? Could it have been prevented? And if so, how could it have been prevented? And then you can decide at that point whether you need to change your procedures or whether you need to train for the inevitability of that happening again or the possibility of that happening again or both. I would say just really sit down and dissect it minute by minute or hour by hour, depending on what happened. How did it happen? And could it have been prevented? And let's just make sure it doesn't happen again. And then in the event that it does, what are we going to do? Did we respond appropriately? Could we have responded better? Sort of those types of things, just breaking it down to a real granular level and figuring out, what went wrong.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think I can add anything to that. That's just about exactly how I would have worded it myself. So
Heck yeah.
That's good. Yeah.
One for the good guys.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is the last question I'm going to ask you, Blake. And I always, as you know, you've been on every season. I always ask a little bit of a version of this at the end of each episode. But what advice would you give to someone that's new to leadership who may be worried about handling emergency situations?
Yeah, again, that's a tough one, Ben. I would say that the most important advice that I would give them is just to prepare yourself as much as possible. I know that's where this started, and I guess sounds like that's where this is going to end. But
coming full circle.
Yeah, that's right. And you can't prepare yourself for everything, but just really take the training that you're given seriously. Ask a lot of questions of experienced fumigators. Ask a lot of questions of experienced folks that maybe aren't fumigators. I've had a lot of conversations. We work directly with a lot of fire departments and first responders and things like that. And I love to ask them questions about how they keep it together in certain circumstances and how did they learn that or were they always like that? And a lot of their answers are different, but to a man or to a woman, it comes down to preparedness, being ready as you possibly can be for that. And then to further that just a little bit, it goes back to leading with emotion, and I guess in this case, not leading with emotion. You have to find a way to stay calm when you're under the pressure. So really those two things, being as prepared as possible, train and drill yourself, train and drill your teams, ask questions, and then, of course, trying to stay calm under the gun.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that you mentioned reaching out and getting guidance from people that are outside of our industry. People who respond to emergencies on a regular basis, like firefighters, EMTs, and other emergency response people, because who better to learn from than people who have to deal with emergency situations on a fairly regular basis, And I think when you talk to these folks, which I have too, you'll find that a lot of them, they have their own personal exercises that they do to keep themselves calm, to keep their emotions out of it, whether it's taking a beat and, taking in a couple of deep breaths, closing your eyes, count to 10. I mean, whatever the case is, they have these little things that they will do to keep themselves calm in the situation. And I know it's really easy to think that the more you're exposed to emergency situations, the easier they get to handle, or the easier it is to deal with them. But after talking to a lot of these emergency responders, I found that, some of them they probably get used to, but I think the adrenaline happens in almost every emergency situation for these folks. They learn how to handle that better. So it's not that they're getting used to it, it's that their routines have become better. They've practiced it, and so it's become easier for them to handle, even though the adrenaline level is always the same.
Yeah, it's virtually impossible to prepare yourself, especially for serious emergencies. But yeah, it's like you said, it really comes down to drilling, honestly, drilling and training and things like that. Like you said, everybody sort of has their own little thing. I've unfortunately been a part of unexpected events in the field, not too many emergencies, but they all sort of hit the same, but they all sort of hit different, if that makes any sense. So It goes full circle again back to expecting the worst, so that when it happens, you're not freaking out and running around. So I agree with you. But like the first responders, again, I know it's repetitive, but talk to a couple firefighters, EMTs. I've even talked to some doctors about how they stay calm under pressure too. So, it's a thing. Like I said, it's not for everybody, and you don't know until you know. But if you're prepared and you're trained, then at least you have a good chance of handling it appropriately.
All right, Blake. Well, that's all I had for you today. Man, this was absolutely valuable information, and I can't thank you enough for sharing some of your insight on how to handle yourself in emergency situations.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity again, Ben. As always, you're doing a great job, and hopefully nobody needs to use this information.
Yeah. That's a good call, yeah.
Yeah. So I appreciate it, man. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
Thanks again to Blake for sharing his insight. Emergencies are never easy, but with the right mindset, preparation, and leadership, they don't have to turn into disasters. Being calm under pressure, making informed decisions, and supporting your team are what real leadership is all about. On the next episode of Dagish America Presents, we'll shift our focus to the customer side of leadership. How putting the client first and leading with service can turn good work into long-term partnerships. And as always, if you have a question, feedback, or a topic suggestion, please send us an email at podcast@dagishamerica.com, or you can reach out to us on your favorite social media platform. Until next time, I'm Ben Harrell. Thanks for listening, and stay safe out there.